The culprits who debased our coins 100%, however, and got away with it, were the lawyers in Congress who supplied the legal means for seizing our gold in 1934, our silver between 1963 and 68, and replaced our lawful money with intangible credit. Our message today is entitled Economic Myths and the Science of Deceit. This is part 14. On the front side of this last break, I was taking a look at the foreword in Bill Still's book, No More National Debt, published in 2011. This foreword written by Frank Maggio, who was arguing against the use of gold and silver as money, for example, because such metals being used as money would allow others to create it, which is impossible. No one has figured out how to create any tangible out of nothing. But he also went on to say that they would be allowed to control or corner the market on those. Well, that is true. There are people who have done that. And how did they corner the market? Well, they cornered and controlled the market with credit, which is the use of absolutely nothing as money. Credit comes from the Latin word credere, which you understand, which means to believe. That's the kind of a system that Frank Maggio and Bill Still believe we ought to have, is the kind of a system that allowed those people to corner and control commodities like gold, silver, and even your labor. Okay? He also pointed out that they're able to counterfeit those things. Well, that's true. But there was a penalty for counterfeiting, particularly when it came to the Coinage Act of April 2nd, 1792, at Section 19, which prescribed a penalty for government officials engaged in debasing our coins, and that penalty was death. Yet it was the public officials, the lawyers in Congress, who supplied the legal framework for seizing our gold in 1934, our silver between 1963 and 68, on behalf of the Federal Reserve System, and replaced our lawful money with intangible credit. Nevertheless, Frank, Bill, and their fellow travelers at American Free Press, American Monetary Institute, the Pilgrims of St. Michael ad nauseum, state emphatically that what Congress and the Federal Reserve System left us with, which is absolutely nothing, is what we must be using, or must use, to save us from the economic extinction caused by Congress and the Federal Reserve. Am I missing something? Well, continuing with Frank Maggio's foreword to Bill Still's book, he goes on to say, quote, Bill's trumpet call is clear. Well, I'll tell you what, it's about the most confusing nonsense, but nevertheless, he says it's clear. He says, sound money must be controlled by and backed by we the people. How do people back money? Money doesn't have to be backed by anything. It's promises to pay money that has to be backed by the money. Okay? He goes on to say that it should be spent, capital letters, spent into existence, and not lent, capital letters, into existence. Well, that's a point well taken. So would Frank and Bill be equally enthusiastic about letting me spend checks and notes into circulation? Checks and notes that are written against absolutely nothing? If not, ask them to tell you why. Then ask them to define the word debt. Now, these folks ignore definitions, so you're going to need to be persistent in order to get a definition, and make sure it's an accurate definition, because they don't like accurate definitions either. Ask them if a check or a note is a debt instrument, and don't let them off the hook. Then ask for their legal theory as to how we, the people, delegated to Congress a power to steal legally, and why we're supposed to trust them with such an unlawful power. It's one thing to learn about certain aspects of bank fraud. After all, most of us have not discovered this on our own. But to advocate a replacement system of fraud and theft in violation of every economic commandment and principle of Scripture is not the way to peace and prosperity. And to show listeners that I don't indulge in petty favoritism, let's go to another book written by another author. This one, The Web of Debt, by Ellen Brown, published in 2007, updated in 2008. And this with regards to Lincoln greenbacks, which is the subject of today's message. She says, quote, they, she means United States notes, they were basically just receipts acknowledging work done or goods delivered, which could be traded in the community for an equivalent value of goods and services. The greenbacks represented man-hours rather than borrowed gold. Wow. The Web of Debt, page 95. This has to be one of the most creative definitions for a promissory note I've ever seen, which may explain why her glossary fails to define a note, or a dollar, money, or debt. I wonder if by claiming equal protection of the law, my receipt for a tractor, riding mower, groceries, hardware items, automobile, house, and so forth, could be leveraged by act of Congress into a means of paying for other stuff, so that I could steal the equivalent value of those receipts in goods and services produced by my fellow citizens. Well, let's continue. She says, quote, the greenback system undergirded Lincoln's program for domestic development. Whoa, just a moment here. The greenbacks undergirded Lincoln's program for domestic development? Civil War is a program of domestic development? On the front side of this last break, we were looking at Ellen Brown's book, The Web of Debt. Ellen Brown's an attorney, by the way. The Web of Debt. And I had gotten up to page 87, where she had said that the greenback system, legal tender notes, undergirded Lincoln's program of domestic development. Did you know that Civil War was a program of domestic development? I guess it is, if you really kind of expand your definition of the word. After all, William Tecumseh Sherman's march to the sea wreaked havoc in the South, utter destruction. They burned just about everything in sight, I guess. And I suppose you could call that a form of urban renewal. You destroy everything and then you rebuild it. So that could be called a program of domestic development. That's a stretch in my book, however. And the reason she says that this was a program of domestic development, these Lincoln greenbacks, was because it provided a much-needed national paper money supply. After Jackson, I'm quoting her now, after Jackson had closed the central bank, the only paper money in circulation were the bank notes issued privately by individual state banks. I'm going to stop right there. Paper money, first off, is a non sequitur. A paper has never been used as money. It's too heavy to be used as money. But she says that the paper money were banknotes. A banknote, for those who still don't know the definition of a note, is a promise to pay money. Now, there's more to it than that, but a note cannot be money because it's a promise to pay it. Okay? She goes on and she says, and they were basically just, she likes those two words in juxtaposition, basically just private promises to pay later in hard currency, brackets, gold or silver, end quote. So banknotes were just, they're just basically just promises to pay later in gold or silver. Yeah, those are insignificant, you see. The greenbacks, she says, on the other hand, were, and she italicizes that for emphasis, the greenbacks, on the other hand, were currency. They were legal tender in themselves. Money that did not have to be repaid later, but was as good as gold in trade. End quote. Ellen Brown, The Web of Debt, page 87. Can you believe that a promissory note is something that doesn't have to be repaid later? Well, let's look at this. The second word in the phrase legal tender is the word tender, which means an offer of money. An offer of money is not money. An offer to pay gold is not gold. Furthermore, greenbacks in their various forms, they existed as demand notes, legal tender notes, interest-bearing notes, and compound interest-bearing notes. All of those carried a promise to pay later on their face. A promise, a tender, or an offer to pay money is not the money it promises to pay later. After the war ended, the Resumption Act of 1875 directed the Treasury to pay down those notes through redemption in gold and silver coin. See, and that coin had begun to refill the vaults after the war ended. Why was it that the Resumption Act directed the Treasury to pay those notes down through redemption? Because those greenbacks were notes. Notes are IOUs, not money. The pronouncements of Ellen Brown and other populists notwithstanding. They were notes of a sort, which they also said on their face. Would to God that our economic saviors would read what's in front of them, and with an understanding as to what the words mean, which they read and write. But she's an attorney and the author of 11 books. I'm an average sort of guy whose comprehension requires a helping hand that only clear and correct definitions can provide. Now, let's return to where we left off in our previous Datum Line broadcast, the opening days of the legal tender debates to which Edwin Vieira provided a backdrop in his 2-volume set called Pieces of 8, published in 2002. And you're dealing with about 1,700 pages of those 2 volumes. Anyway, we ended by suggesting that a constitutional alternative was available to Congress, if needed, other than to increase taxes or to issue legal tender notes, which were in themselves a form of disguised taxation. This alternative, the power to borrow money on the credit of the United States provided by Article 1, Section 8 and Paragraph 2 of the Constitution, they later used effectively. Our ancestors did not give them the power to borrow credit on the credit of the United States. You'll remember from our last message that it was Bill Still, in his book, No More National Debt, at page 91, who said, with regards to this power to borrow, quote, "This question needs to be asked again and again. Why would a sovereign nation borrow when it has the power to create?" End quote. So what he's asking is, why would a sovereign nation borrow money when it has the power to create money? That's what he's saying. Since there is a sensible answer to the question should not have to be asked again and again. Congress didn't have the power to create money, which is why we the people gave them the power to borrow money. If you could write checks and issue funny money at no cost to yourself and force everyone else to take it in this land of the free and home of the brave, what would the money look like that you borrowed? Who would you borrow it from, and why would you be borrowing it? But try to convince these folks that the power to create money out of absolutely nothing doesn't exist as a lawful grant of constitutional authority from we the people, and see how far that gets you. As for the power to borrow, how could this power be exercised in harmony with Scripture? The borrower, after all, is servant to the lender. It says so in Proverbs 22:7. And we're told to owe no man anything, at Romans chapter 13 and verse 8, for example. However, circumstances do occur, perhaps beyond our control, under which a paramount need to borrow money may arise. What then? Can we borrow without violating the will of God? And can we lend money on the same basis? More specifically, may Congress borrow without violating the will of God on behalf of modern-day Israelites? If you'll bear with me, this seems like an appropriate place to make some pertinent observations on this point. First, the Constitution does provide for Congress to borrow money, which money conformed somewhat to the law of just weights and measures at Deuteronomy chapter 25, verses 13 through 16. It, the Constitution, does not grant the power to borrow intangible credit, which violates that commandment of God. Since a banker's stock in trade is credit and not tangible gold and silver lawful money,